Now to an intriguing story about Australia's intelligence organisation, ASIO. An article in the Nine newspapers last week reported a raid by ASIO earlier this year on former senior intelligence officer Neil Fergus. Fergus runs one of Australia's foremost private security firms that's provided security to multiple Olympic Games. The raid was linked in the media to Fergus's alleged involvement in an investigation of a 1970s-era traitor inside ASIO working for the Russians. I spoke to Neil Fergus earlier. Neil Fergus, welcome to 7:30.
Thank you.
You were raided by ASIO earlier this year. Can you describe what happened?
It was 8 o'clock on a Saturday morning in February. There was a knock on the door. A couple of officers identified themselves, had them in the lounge room. There were a couple of comments, questions, which I didn't find particularly... well, I actually said, if we're not going to have a proper conversation, maybe it's time to leave. And at that point, they got on the mobile phone and called in a search team and executed a warrant against my private residence.
Did they show you the warrant, and what did it say?
The warrant is very generic. It doesn't say what the facts and grounds are for the warrant. It just says the warrant is being served, and if I have a problem with the actions or activities of the personnel, I can complain to the organisation, or indeed I can put in a complaint to the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security that has the oversight role for the intelligence agencies.
Now, just on that morning, as this is happening, had you had any warning from ASIO that they wanted to speak to you?
No, I had had continuing contact with members of the organisation in terms of our role, my company's role as an international security advisory. But there would be no forewarning that they considered that any of my activities might be prejudicial to national security, or indeed specifically against the heads of security within the ASIO Act.
Now, a warrant of that nature has to be signed off by the Attorney General. Are you aware of any facts, any evidence that could have convinced Mark Dreyfus that the raid on you, your home, was justified?
No. I have absolute confidence in Mr Dreyfus as the nation's senior law officer and the Attorney General. The issue, of course, was what analysis underpinned the facts and grounds that might have been presented to the Attorney General.
At the same time, a warrant of that nature, we assume, would have to have been signed off also by Mike Burgess, the Director General of ASIO. Again, the question is, are you aware of any evidence that Mike Burgess might have to justify a search of your premises?
None at all. Any activities that I've done or my colleagues and associates have done have been consistent with protecting national security in Australia and Western democracies. We have never, ever engaged in any activities prejudicial to national security.
Let's go back to the day of the raid. So how many people are there in your house at that stage, and what do they tell you in the course of the search that they are looking for, and what the purpose of their visit is?
The only other person in the house, thankfully from my family, was my wife, Sue. She was, of course, just as surprised as I was. The conversation commenced about their concern that a foreign intelligence services was interested in what I did, which is hardly illuminating. But then during the course of the search that ensued, there are a number of comments and questions in relation to my part-time media role, which I've done for, as I pointed out, when the supervisor in charge of the raid said, "You speak to the media too much." I said, "I've been under contract to the media for 23 years. Not 3 months, not 3 years, 23 years. What's that got to do with invading my house and raiding my house?" There was no response. There were remarks made about my interactions with the media and on the media during the course of these events, which frankly I regarded as inappropriate and evidence of impropriety.
What were the ASIO officers looking for? What did they want from you that day?
Well, I don't know, but clearly they didn't find anything because I haven't been charged, and some months later, while trying to get my possessions returned that were taken during that search, I was told that ASIO had drawn a line under this and it wouldn't be proceeded with further. And at that point I asked for an apology to my family from Burgess, the Director General, and I was told that wouldn't be recommended. And at that point I said, well, then I'll exercise my democratic rights to put a complaint into the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security, the Honourable Christopher Jessup, KC, who has that very important role, positioned within the Attorney General's Department in Canberra.
And just to be clear, what did they take from you that day?
PCs, computers, mobile phones, documents, papers. I'm still waiting for the return of my wife's diaries from the 1980s, which I shouldn't joke about because obviously she's not very impressed by that. Whatever they thought might have been relevant to whatever had prompted their inquiries.
Now, 9 newspapers and the ABC reported on this raid. They said it was related to investigations by you and others of an historic espionage case of a former senior ASIO officer who was working for the Soviets starting in the early 1970s. Is this what the raid was about?
Well, as they told me, they were there in relation to interest in me by a foreign intelligence service. It wasn't Russia that they mentioned, but then during the course of the search, most of the remarks either related to Russia or my various media appearances, including a rather caustic remark that I had criticised an ASIO submission to a parliamentary joint committee during an interview on AM radio on ABC. A number of comments about my modest participation in an ABC Four Corners program on the person you spoke about, where I didn't speak as a former intelligence officer, I spoke as an international security commentator, saying that the work done by a US-based historian on this was quite breathtaking and quite significant. And I was accused during the raid of providing sensitive information to that historian, which was fairly easy to rebut because I said if you watched the program properly, you'd have seen the historian said he'd heard the name of the so-called ASIO traitor from 3 defectors.
Is there any basis for the claim that you, which appeared in the 9 newspapers' coverage of this, is there any basis for the claim that you improperly worked with former KGB officials in investigating the Soviet penetration of ASIO? Officials, I should say.
Absolutely, absolutely not. That story was leaked to a journalist in the Sydney Morning Herald who sent me a text saying his sources were senior Australian intelligence officials in Canberra. That's when we go beyond. The raid was legal, it was signed by our Attorney General. I question the propriety of the facts and grounds. However, Sarah, last Wednesday, when the Sydney Morning Herald published a story, and if this is true, prima facie there has been a criminal offence committed under section 142.2 of the Commonwealth Crimes Act, abuse of public office, to pass information injurious to me and my family to a journalist for what reason? To somehow preempt the potential findings of the Honourable Christopher Jessup, the IGES? I don't know why. It's a ludicrous situation. It's not appropriate for Western liberal democracy. It's not appropriate for Australia's national security agencies. It's caused a lot of questions to be asked, as you know, and you're asking them, not just in Australia, but with our international allies. What's going on?
To be clear, it's your belief that ASIO leaked the fact of the raid earlier this year to the Sydney Morning Herald?
A credible journalist put that in a text to me. He didn't say ASIO in the text, but there's only one intelligence agency that's been involved in these matters, and that is ASIO.
What do you want from Mike Burgess, the Director General of ASIO, now?
Well, I still want an apology to my family, but it is much bigger than me and my family. What we want to know is that the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation is operating legally, ethically and being properly accountable. And the Australian people deserve that. And at the moment, there are some significant questions which Mr Jessup is trying to get to the bottom of. And we wish him well in his work.
Neil Fergus, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
A pleasure, Sarah.
We asked ASIO to comment on the claims made by Neil Fergus tonight that ASIO officers raiding his home had criticised his media appearances and that ASIO had leaked the fact of the raid to 9 newspapers. They said, quote, ASIO does not comment on operational activity. As a general statement, however, ASIO can only obtain a warrant to investigate threats to security, not to discuss media appearances. With regards to your second question, that was the leaking of the raid to the media, ASIO said, quote, this claim is completely false and the individual knows it.